The rise, the crown where the sun never set. It doesn't always take a great enemy to destroy an empire. Sometimes its own wealth does the job. And in history, no nation experienced that irony more tragically than Spain. There was a time when Spain truly ruled much of the known world. Today, when we hear the empire on which the sun never sets, we think of Britain. But that phrase was first said about Spain. In the 1500s, a single crown commanded lands stretching from Europe to the Americas, from Asia to Africa. Spanish ships anchored on every shore, and under the same banner the sun rose and fell across continents. Spain had built the first truly global empire in history. A world ruled from one center, and soon it became so powerful that people said, "The sun never sets on the Spanish Empire." But here's where the irony begins. What destroyed this empire wasn't war, or invasion, or enemies. It was its own treasure. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail for the New World. And for Spain, that voyage became the turning point of an era. It was as if a divine hand had offered them the key to boundless riches. In the Americas, enormous deposits of gold and silver were found, so vast that the rest of Europe could hardly believe it. The Aztecs fell. The Inca Empire collapsed. And in the heart of the Andes, a mountain was discovered, Potosí. That mountain was filled with so much silver that locals called it the mountain that eats men, because thousands of indigenous workers died inside its dark tunnels, suffocating in the depths while extracting the empire's lifeblood. Yet the flow of silver never stopped. For more than a century, treasure-laden ships crossed the Atlantic carrying mountains of wealth to Spain's shores. The precious metals were unloaded at the port of Seville. Streets shimmered with gold and silver. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain imported nearly 180,000 tons of silver and 2,000 tons of gold. That was more than all of Europe had mined in the previous 1,000 years combined. And this treasure didn't just change Europe, it reshaped the entire world. Because for the first time in history, wealth connected continents through global trade. Ships from Seville sailed to the Mediterranean, north to the Low Countries and across the Pacific to Manila, where Spanish silver was traded for Chinese silk and porcelain. Spain had built the first global economy, and it sat proudly at its center. By the time England founded its first permanent colony, Jamestown, in 1607, Mexico City already had universities, printing presses, and cathedrals. Lima was a thriving metropolis. St. Augustine in Florida had become the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States, decades before Jamestown. Spain wasn't just ahead, it was centuries ahead. While others struggled to survive in swamps, Spain was building a world empire. But when you stand at the peak of power, you rarely see the fall that's already begun beneath your feet. Because history plays the same game every time. Collapse begins at the summit. Spain could not manage the treasure it held. It mistook gold and silver for infinite strength, but real power comes from how wisely you use it. The poison of money. From wealth to poverty. While Spain was living through its golden age, a quiet crisis had already begun. Each time treasure fleets reached the ports, kings celebrated with festivals, and churches echoed with prayers of gratitude. But beneath the songs and the celebrations, they failed to notice the problem that would soon devour them. The wealth wasn't flowing into the country. It was flowing into prices. From the early 1500s to the late 1600s, prices in Spain nearly quadrupled. Bread, wine, cloth, rent, Everything soared. It was the world's first great inflation. Centuries later, economists would call it the price revolution. The flood of silver had destroyed the value of money. In a town where a loaf of bread cost 1 coin, and suddenly 10 times more coins arrived, that same loaf didn't become richer. The coin became poorer. Bread never changed. What lost value was the money itself, and that was Spain's fate. At first everyone thought they were getting richer, but in time the nation grew poorer, because money is only as strong as trust. And when there's too much of it, trust collapses. Ordinary people couldn't understand. Tons of silver were pouring in from the mines, yet their tables grew emptier. They were supposed to be wealthier, but life kept getting harder. Soon most people could no longer afford to live in their own country. Rents rose, basic goods became luxuries, and wages stayed frozen. In an empire full of silver, people didn't struggle for gold. They struggled to survive. For the nobles and the crown, things were different. They were the first to touch the silver. They spent it before prices caught up. The rich grew richer, while the common people sank deeper into poverty. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because throughout history, every wave of inflation has always protected the powerful first and burned the poor last. But inflation wasn't Spain's only mistake. Instead of investing the silver into production, the king spent it on imports. Fine fabrics from Italian merchants, ships from Dutch builders, weapons from German craftsmen. Spain forgot its own producers. It stopped making and started buying. It became a rich customer, but never a creator. Each time a treasure fleet arrived, the empire could breathe for a while, but soon after prices exploded again. Because what keeps an economy alive isn't gold, it's the continuity of labor. And Spain never understood that. Worse still, it kept spending on wars. The Habsburg monarchs saw themselves as defenders of Catholicism, and that mission drained their fortune. Wars against the Ottomans, the Dutch Revolt, the French Wars of Religion. Each campaign consumed mountains of silver. In 1588, the great Spanish Armada set sail to crush Protestant England. It was the costliest military operation in Spanish history. And when that mighty fleet sank in the North Sea storms, it dragged the empire's finances down with it. The wars weren't won, but the debts were. And then Spain fell into the most dangerous habit of all, spending tomorrow's treasure today. Even before the silver left the mines, the crown was already spending it. The Fugger banking family in Germany, the Genoese financiers, they all lent massive sums to the Spanish crown in exchange for shares of future treasure fleets. Spain mortgaged its own future. It tried to pay today's debts with tomorrow's silver. And that was the beginning of the end, because if a fleet sank in a storm or was captured by pirates, Spain couldn't pay. And when it couldn't pay, it defaulted. In 1557, 1,575, 1,596, and again in 1607. 4 bankruptcies in just 50 years. The richest empire on earth was declaring we're broke every 20 years. Wealth had become an illusion. They had the money, but not the value. Pirates and collapse. An empire. Devouring itself by now, Spain had become a giant made of silver, shining from the outside, but rotting within. Kings and bankers still trusted the treasure fleets from the New World. But those ships had become the empire's greatest weakness, because the entire system depended on just a few convoys, and those convoys became targets. England and the Netherlands knew they couldn't defeat Spain in open war, but they could strike its lifeline, and they did. The pirates of that era weren't mere thieves. They were weapons, tools of economic warfare. Queen Elizabeth herself gave Sir Francis Drake permission to capture Spanish ships and bring home their treasure, and Drake did more than succeed. In the 1580s, as he circled the globe, he plundered Spain's treasure galleons. And when he returned to England, his loot equaled half of the nation's annual income. This wasn't piracy. It was economic sabotage. In 1628, Dutch privateer Piet Hein captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet off Cuba. Value 11 million guilders, billions in today's money. A single strike like that was enough to shake an empire. Imagine this. One pirate fleet captures one Spanish convoy. And a global superpower plunges into crisis. Why? Because that silver had already been spent before it even reached Spain. The money was still at sea, but the debt was already on land. If the ships didn't arrive, the loans couldn't be paid. And when debts weren't paid, trust vanished. And when trust vanished, everything collapsed. Each lost fleet wasn't just a maritime disaster, it was a national bankruptcy in real time. When pirates sank a Spanish galleon, bankers across Europe lost their fortunes. Every cannon fired on the ocean shook Madrid's economy on land. Meanwhile, Spain's rivals weren't idle. England and the Netherlands reinvested their stolen silver into the future. They built new ships, trade routes, banks, and companies. The Dutch opened the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. The English expanded the East India Company. Every Spanish ship that sank helped them rise higher. Spain, however, refused to wake from its golden dream. Each new fleet brought temporary relief, debts paid, hope renewed, but soon after, more loans, more debts. One fleet arrived, another left. One step forward, two steps back. A cycle with no escape. Meanwhile, life at home was breaking down. Inflation crushed the people. Bread prices soared, wages stood still, and taxes climbed endlessly. Peasants struggled with hunger, while palaces still overflowed with feasts. The treasury was full, but the country was empty. Spain had become a giant feeding on itself. The once feared Spanish Armada was now just a shadow. The navy weakened, the shipyards closed, the vessels rotted in harbor. The king still saw himself as the guardian of faith. But neither faith nor fortune remained. During the 30 Years' War, Europe burned in chaos, and Spain threw its last resources into the flames. When the war finally ended, only exhaustion and ruins were left. By the mid-1600s, Spain still looked vast on maps, but in reality it was just a hollow shell. Debts had piled into mountains, inflation had drained its people, wars had emptied its vaults, and pirates had stolen its lifeline. All that remained was an illusion, the illusion of wealth, the mirror of history. What is real wealth? When Spain finally hit rock bottom, others were already learning how to rise from its mistakes. England, the Netherlands, and France all watched closely, and each came to the same realization. True wealth doesn't lie in mines, it lies in systems. Spain's colonies existed only to extract treasure, to send gold and silver home. Those lands weren't meant to grow, only to feed the crown. But the English and the Dutch thought differently. For them, colonies weren't just about money, they were about production. North America may not have had gold, but it had fertile land, cotton, tobacco, sugar cane, resources that produced wealth year after year. The English began cultivating the soil. The Dutch expanded trade. Spain waited for its treasure fleets. But the others didn't wait. They built their own wealth, from nothing but discipline, commerce, and innovation. They founded companies, opened banks, and created trade systems that grew stronger with each passing decade. One chased gold and silver, the other built systems, and in the end, the winner was obvious. Spain's fortune faded, but those who built systems endured, because what one kind of power dies when the treasure runs out, but the other replicates itself forever. Time moved on. The empire that once terrified Europe grew silent. Debt mounted, the people grew poorer, and the navy decayed. The king still sat upon his golden throne. But that throne was no longer a symbol of power. It was the monument to the past. And that is one of history's greatest lessons. Wealth is not measured by how much money you have, but by how long you can keep creating it. When a nation stops producing and only consumes, it eventually consumes itself. Spain lived that truth, and we are still living it. Today's banks, markets, and credit systems are the treasure fleets of our age. As long as they float, everything seems fine. But when one ship sinks or one bank collapses, the entire system trembles, and people begin to ask, what is real wealth? Real wealth isn't gold or silver, it's production, discipline, and systems built on trust. Spain never understood that difference, but its rivals did, and they inherited the future. The whisper of history. Spain's story still echoes, a quiet reminder that wealth isn't always what it seems. Riches can deceive, but history never lies. Those who truly listen to it learn how to protect their future, because history always keeps the answers. You just have to know where to look. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.